Chapter 1. A whiff of lavender and a step too late. The late afternoon sun filtered gently through the tall trees of Larkspur Hollow, casting dappled shadows over cobbled lanes and ivy-strewn fences. There was a peacefulness about the village, an unspoken agreement that life here ought to proceed with civility and a certain rhythm. Morning post at 8, gardening by 10, and tea precisely at 4. On this particular Tuesday, Miss Jane Marple was engaged in her usual summer ritual of tending to her garden. Her straw hat shaded a face line not just by age, but by long observation. Her gloved hands nimbly snipped away at over-eager hollyhocks, which were threatening to eclipse her neat rows of white peonies. The heady perfume of lavender and sweet pea hung in the air, mingled with the faint tang of earth and distant chimney smoke. A blackbird sang from the hedge, and bees droned lazily over the wisteria that hung like velvet ropes from the garden arch. All seemed perfectly in order, until there it was. A sound. Footsteps. They came faintly, muted yet distinct, with the subtle crunch of weight on gravel or compressed soil. Not on the garden path where her own shoes had disturbed the dust, nor from the street behind the rose trellis. No, it seemed to come from somewhere deeper, beneath. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Miss Marple froze, secateurs held midair. Her hearing was not what it had been in her youth, but her instincts remained as sharp as the shears in her hand. She turned, slowly, peering toward the far end of the garden near the ancient brick wall that separated her property from the back of St. Winifred's chapel grounds. Silence. The wind teased the edges of her cardigan, and a petal from the climbing clematis fluttered to the soil. Nothing stirred beyond the usual rustle of leaves and the faint, metallic creak of Mrs. Redcliffe's gate across the lane. Birds, perhaps, she murmured to herself, not believing it for a moment. The garden at St. Winifred's was rarely disturbed, save for the gentle steps of Lionel Steeple, the aging verger, who took great pride in tending to its sacred earth. A fastidious man with polished shoes and an encyclopedic knowledge of biblical flora, Lionel had not, to her recollection, missed a Monday tending session in over a decade. And yet, on this Tuesday afternoon, there was a peculiar emptiness about the chapel grounds. No humming, no scraping of tools, no gentle whistling of Jerusalem. Miss Marple glanced once more toward the garden wall and tucked the moment away like a seed. Things often revealed themselves in time, especially in Larkspur Hollow, where appearances were the most carefully tended things of all. By Wednesday morning, whispers began to slink through the village like fog rolling off the moors. Lionel Steeple had not been seen since Sunday service. At the greengrocer's, Mrs. Hardcastle gasped so loudly at the news she dropped the cucumber. But he always picks up his eggs on Tuesday morning, and I just put a dozen aside for him, large browns like he likes. At the bakery, Mr. Figgin solemnly declared, didn't even fetch his rye loaf. That's not like him, not at all. By midday, the Reverend Cotterill had paid a visit to Lionel's small stone cottage behind the church. Everything, he reported, was in immaculate order. Boots lined up, kettle washed and dried, bed made with creases so tight they could bounce a penny. But no sign of Lionel himself. The vicar, a mild-mannered man with large spectacles and an unfortunate lisp, looked genuinely perplexed. He did mention the weeds were returning near the sundial, he said during a hastily convened tea with Miss Marple and Mrs. Redcliffe. Said he'd deal with them on Monday morning. Perhaps he's gone to visit his sister in Chipping Underwood. His sister passed away in April, Miss Marple reminded him gently. Oh, quite right. That single quotes S. Rather inconvenient, isn't it? Mrs. Redcliffe scowled loudly and poured herself a second cup. People don't just vanish, Reverend. Not in Larkspur Hollow. We are not one of those places where awful things happen and nobody notices. No, Miss Marple said softly. We're the sort of place where everyone notices. But often, after the fact. On Thursday morning, Constable Hartley Young, earnest, and forever fussing with his notebook, stood near the chapel garden fence with a pinched expression. He was accompanied by Sergeant Graves, a gruff man who had seen real trouble during his London years and was perpetually unimpressed by missing cats, stolen laundry, or any mystery involving jam jars. But this, he admitted, was different. The garden behind the chapel looked as ordinary as ever. Lavender bushes leaned toward the sun, and the bishop's weed spread lazily between the gravestones. But it was near the base of the clematis trellis, just beside the crumbling sundial stuck forever at 2:20, that something protruded. "Boot," Hartley announced. "Not just any boot," Graves muttered, crouching beside it. "Polished, monogrammed, steeples, I'd wager." The Reverend, who had been nervously wringing his hat beside the compost bin, turned gray. "Oh dear." "Stand back, Vicar," Graves instructed, gesturing with a gloved hand. Together, the two men began to clear the surrounding soil with delicate, almost reverent care. Miss Marple, arriving just in time to catch sight of the digging, paused quietly behind the wrought iron fence. She said nothing, but her eyes were sharp as flint. What they unearthed was not pleasant. Mr. Lionel Steeple lay curled like a sleeping child beneath. The roots of an overgrown iris, one arm twisted awkwardly behind him. His spectacles were shattered, his collar stained, and his face, once kindly if forgettable, was frozen in an expression of mild surprise. "Been there a few days," Graves muttered. "Couldn't be seen with the way the plants cover this side." Constable Hartley looked pale. "But how did no one hear or see anything?" "Because people rarely look down when they think everything is in order," said Miss Marple, more to herself than to anyone else. By late afternoon, the whole of Larkspur Hollow was in a state of quietly orchestrated chaos. At the hairdresser's, Mrs. Lynde was nearly in tears. "I just saw him on Sunday. He said something about needing to trim the box hedge near the shed." "Why would anyone hurt Lionel?" "I heard," whispered Miss Tilbury, eyes wide, "that he was in trouble with the church funds." "Nonsense," snapped Mrs. Hargreaves. "He barely earned more than a grocer's lad. What would he be stealing?" At the spinning group, the theories were wilder still. "Smuggling," declared Hetty Grubb. "The chapel's on a ley line. He could have been involved with dark things, rituals." "He had a mole in the shape of a rabbit," whispered Agatha. "Row, and they say that's a mark of—" "Oh, for heaven's sake," Miss Marple said gently, setting down her knitting. "It's far more likely someone killed him for something very ordinary. A grudge, a secret, a love turned sour." They stared at her, silent. "People do far worse things for far less reason," she added. "Especially when they think no one is watching." That evening, Miss Marple sat by her window with a steaming cup of chamomile tea and Matthew the canary chirping softly nearby. She was not afraid. Fear, after all, came from surprise. But she was unsettled. She recalled how Lionel had looked during Sunday service, pale, distracted, unusually clumsy. He had dropped the hymn sheets and forgotten the third verse of "Guide Me, O Thou Great Redeemer." More oddly still, when she had remarked upon the flourishing clematis by the garden wall, he had paused and said, "Things have a way of coming back up, don't they, Miss Marple?" At the time, she'd assumed he meant bulbs. But now she wondered. And then there were the footsteps. The ones beneath the garden. She sipped her tea and watched as the vicar, alone now, paced outside the chapel. Gait, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped. Something weighed on him. "Tell me, Matthew," she said to the bird, "why would a man so particular about his boots be found with only one on his feet? And why," she added, almost whispering, "was his boot resting by the trellis, but his body nearly 6 feet away beneath the iris bed?" The bird chirped. The dusk deepened. And Miss Marple, quiet and composed, settled back in her chair, her needles at rest for now. Chapter 2, Whispers in the Church Peewit, was the sort of Sunday that began with the scent of baking bread and ended with unanswered questions. though the morning sun streamed gently through the stained glass windows of St. Winifred's Chapel, painting the pews in delicate jewel tones. The usual sense of calm was absent. A silence, thick and uneasy, pressed upon the congregation. Like a sermon no one dared to give, Reverend Cotterill cleared his throat for the third time, his fingers trembling slightly as he adjusted his notes. He had rewritten his homily 3 times the night before, torn between offering spiritual comfort and avoiding speculation over the discovery in the chapel garden. Ultimately, he settled on Psalm 130. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord, though it now seemed far too literal for comfort. Miss Marple sat quietly in her usual place 3 rows from the back, her gloved hands folded neatly on her lap. Beside her, Mrs. Redcliffe muttered prayers under her breath in rhythm with the organ, and young Harriet Banbury twisted her lace handkerchief with such nervous energy one might expect it to unravel entirely. Not a soul mentioned Lionel Steeple. Aloud, though nearly every pair of eyes flipped toward the now vacant verger's chair beside the chancel. A small vase of flowers had been placed there in tribute white lily, which Miss Marple thought rather ill-chosen, given their funerary symbolism. Still, silence had a peculiar texture in Larkspur Hollow. It stretched long across pews and into minds, but it did not bring peace. It made people restless. And restlessness, in Miss Marple's experience, often stirred things better left undisturbed. After the service, villagers spilled out into the churchyard in slow, cautious clusters, as though afraid of treading on ground that had only just given up its secrets. The Reverend remained behind, speaking in hushed tones to Sergeant Graves, who had taken a sudden and uncharacteristic interest in Sunday worship. Since Lionel's body was unearthed, Miss Marple, never one to hover unnecessarily, found herself drawn toward the stone bench beneath the elder tree, where Ethel Dobbins had already begun holding court. I always said he was a man of secrets, Ethel announced with satisfaction. Far too tidy. No one irons their underclothes unless they've got something to hide. Nonsense, sniffed Mrs. Banbury. Lionel was a quiet sort, painfully shy. The sort who sends his Christmas cards in October and takes 2 sugars. Out of habit, not taste. Exactly, muttered Mr. Applewhite, appearing suddenly with his usual air of slightly damp suspicion. Too quiet. You know what they say about the still ones. They make good soups, offered young Tommy. Griggs, to a round of indulgent chuckles. Miss Marple watched the flow of conversation with quiet interest. Gossip in a village such as Larkspur Hollow was never mere entertainment. It was the shifting of masks, the rebalancing of roles. People spoke not to share the truth, but to frame it, to guide suspicion away from themselves and toward others, to protect what they feared might be unearthed next. And in this case, Lionel Steeple's death had rattled more than just nerves. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a courtesy call to the vicarage, bringing with her a jar of preserved gooseberries and the polite offer of companionship over tea. The Reverend accepted both gratefully, if a little distractedly, and led her to the drawing room, where the curtains remained half-drawn and the atmosphere carried the faint smell of candle wax and melancholy. It's been difficult, Miss Marple, he said, stirring his tea twice clockwise, once counterclockwise, as he always did. The garden was his domain, you see. He took such pride in it. I can't begin to understand who would wish him harm. Sometimes, Miss Marple said gently, harm is not born of hatred, but of fear, or desperation. He blinked at her. You believe it was murder, then? I believe a man like Mr. Steeple does not bury himself in flower beds. The vicar rubbed his forehead. Quite, though the police have been infuriatingly tight-lipped. They're awaiting a coroner's report, something about blunt trauma. Miss Marple nodded. May I ask, had he seemed troubled of late? Distracted? Frightened? The Reverend hesitated. I did notice him jump when I dropped a hymnal last week. But Lionel was always tightly wounded. I assumed it was nerves. Nerves. Don't make a man forget the offertory schedule, she murmured. Which, if I recall, he did last Sunday. The Reverend blinked. I hadn't noticed, nor did most. But he looked quite pale, I thought. His hands were trembling. They sipped in silence for a moment. Then, quietly, Miss Marple asked, "What about the shed?" He looked up. The shed? The tool shed behind the chapel. The door was unlocked when I passed Tuesday morning. It struck me as unusual. A pause. It shouldn't have been, he admitted. Lionel always kept it locked. He was particular about the gardening implements. Miss Marple set down her cup. May I see it? The shed was little more than a lean-to of aged timber and warped glass panes, nestled behind the chapel wall and hidden from most of the graveyard by a row of shrubs. It smelled of soil linseed oil and rust. Inside, the usual assortment of rakes, spades, trowels, and seed boxes hung with geometric precision. But something felt shifted. Miss Marple stepped carefully inside, her eyes moving not to what was present, but to what was absent. There was a dark patch of soil just inside. The door not yet fully dry. A pair of gloves hung askew, as if hastily replaced. And in the far corner, a watering can with a dent she didn't recall seeing before. She stooped slightly. Did he have visitors? The Reverend looked startled, not that I'm aware of, though. Now you mention it, I did see someone walking past here Monday morning. I assumed it was Lionel. Did you see their face? He hesitated. No, just a figure in a dark coat. Carrying something. Miss Marple straightened. I see. She didn't speak further, but her mind was already weaving threads. A figure in a coat. A dented can. A pair of gloves carelessly returned. A garden is a place of peace, but also of concealment. And Lionel, she was certain, had known something. Something that made him nervous. Something that had ultimately gotten him killed. That evening, the golden light of dusk pooled over the cottages of Larkspur Hollow. Windows glowed softly with lamplight. Curtains were drawn. Kettles whistled. But inside the minds of the villagers, shadows remained. Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, pen in hand, jotting a short letter to her niece in London. It was filled with harmless pleasantries about roses, afternoon cream buns, and a dreadful lace pattern she regretted attempting. Only once did she mention Lionel Steeple. A curious matter, she wrote. But as you know, my dear, people seldom kill without cause. And the roots of violence, like weeds, often run deeper than they appear. She sealed the letter, stood, and crossed to her bedroom window. From there, she could just see the edge of the chapel garden. The clematis rustled slightly in the breeze. A shadow moved beyond the sundial. She watched for a long time. There were secrets still to surface. And the footsteps beneath the garden, she believed, had not yet reached their end. Chapter 3. The shed, the gloves, and the girl who knew too much. The following morning dawned pale and unsettled, with clouds gathered low over the village like gray eaves. A drizzle had begun by 8 o'clock, nothing dramatic, just the sort of persistent, misty rain that dampened hems and spirits in equal measure. The weather, it seemed, was in quiet sympathy with Larkspur Hollow's current mood. Miss Marple, however, remained undeterred. She had risen early, as always, and completed her modest breakfast of boiled egg and toast while reading over the newspaper. The article about Lionel Steeple's death was predictably brief. Village verger found dead in garden. Police investigating. Just below it, a smaller column reported the winner of the Larkspur Hollow Flower Society's annual Dahlia Prize. Miss Marple noted, with mild amusement, that Mrs. Pendle had once again triumphed, likely due more to her skill in persuasion than in soil. But Miss Marple's thoughts were not on dahlias this morning. Instead, her mind returned to the shed. The gloves hung askew, the dented watering can, and the Reverend's vague memory of a figure in a dark coat passing by on Monday morning. It wasn't much. But in Miss Marple's experience, mysteries rarely began with thunderclaps. They began with a breath, a pause, a missing boot, or a tremble in someone's voice. She reached for her shawl and prepared to visit someone who had been on her mind since the funeral lily were placed in the verger's chair, Harriet Banbury. Harriet Banbury, 17 and slight as a willow reed, lived with her widowed mother in a modest cottage near the orchard. Her father had died during the war, and her mother, once a vibrant presence in the village, had since become a quiet woman who rarely left home save for Sunday service and the occasional trip to the chemist. Harriet, on the other hand, had always been a curious girl, too observant for her age, too clever by half. Miss Marple had noticed her restlessness at church, her keen eyes flickering about the congregation like a swallow searching for currents in the air. She rarely spoke at village events, but always seemed to be listening. This, Miss Marple had found, was often more valuable. When Harriet answered the door, she looked pale. Her hair was tied back hastily, and a smear of soil streaked her apron. She blinked in surprise to find Miss Marple standing at the threshold, holding a tin of walnut biscuits and her umbrella. "Good morning, dear," Miss Marple said brightly. "I wondered if your mother might be in. I've brought something sweet and thought a little company might cheer the day." Harriet hesitated a fraction too long before opening the door wider. "She's napping," she said quietly. "But please come in. She won't mind." Inside, the cottage was warm but cluttered. Knitting lay abandoned on the arm of a chair. A kettle steamed gently on the stove. Miss Marple allowed herself to be led to the small kitchen table, where a mismatched tea set had been left out. Though only one cup had been used. Harriet busied herself immediately, pouring fresh tea, setting out a plate, and slicing into the biscuits with the nervous energy of someone desperate to appear calm. "I imagine it's been difficult," Miss Marple said gently, sipping her tea. Lionel was a fixture in the chapel. One feels the absence keenly, even when the person was not especially central. Harriet nodded but said nothing. "You must have seen him often, helping around the garden?" She paused, then said slowly, "Sometimes. I used to walk that way after errands." He always nodded, rarely spoke. "I recall seeing you near the chapel on Monday morning, I believe," Miss Marple said casually, "when I was out trimming the hollyhocks." Harriet's spoon clinked sharply against the teacup. "Did you? I suppose I might have been out then." "I don't remember." It would have been around 9:30. Harriet looked down at her lap. Her fingers curled around the edge of the tablecloth. "Was it you who placed the lily by his chair?" Miss Marple asked, her voice light. The girl glanced up, startled. "No, that must have been someone else." "Oh." "I wondered. They were very fresh. No card, of course." For a long moment, Harriet said nothing. Then, quietly, she asked, "Do you think someone killed him, Miss Marple?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that a man who feared something might be found in his garden and then is discovered buried in it is unlikely to have died of natural causes." Harriet's hands twisted in her lap. "He wasn't a bad man," she said in a low voice. "Just careful, quiet." "You knew him better than most then." The girl hesitated again. "Not well. I mean, not personally, but I saw things." "Such as?" Harriet bit her lip. "Sometimes he argued with someone. A man, I don't know who. It always happened behind the chapel, where no one could hear. Except if you were by the apple trees." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "What did the man look like?" "Tall, wore a coat with a wide collar. I couldn't see his face properly, but I think he had a limp. Not always. Just now and then, like something old was bothering him." "And when did you last see him?" Harriet looked up, her eyes wide. "Monday morning." When Miss Marple returned home later that afternoon, the drizzle had eased, but the air retained its damp chill. She changed into dry stockings, made herself a modest sandwich, and sat by the fire with her notebook. A few notes already marked. The page, Lionel seen arguing behind chapel figure in long coat, possibly limping. Harriet witnessed Monday morning shed unlocked. Unusual and boot misplaced, she stared at the final line for a long moment, then crossed the room and lifted an old gardening catalog from her bookshelf. Tucked inside was an article she'd clipped years ago, a piece about identifying footprints from soil compression. Miss Marple had no illusions about forensic science. It had its uses, certainly, but it was human nature she trusted most. Still, the mention of a limp intrigued her, not simply because of what it suggested about the visitor, but because it would have affected his gait, and perhaps, just perhaps, left something behind. Something like uneven footprints, compressed soil, a pattern missed by eyes looking for something more obvious. Later that evening, just before dusk, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. It was Sergeant Graves, his cap under one arm, his brow furrowed as though he were wrestling with something. Unpleasant. "Apologies for calling so late, Miss Marple," he said, stepping inside. "Thought you might want to know the coroner's report came back. Blunt force trauma to the back of the head, not a fall. Too clean. Something heavy, rounded. Possibly iron. No defensive wounds." Miss Marple nodded solemnly. "So we are looking at murder then," Graves sighed. "Looks that way. I'd appreciate it if this stayed between us for now. We haven't made an official statement, of course." He hesitated at the door. "And one more thing. There were scratches on his palms. Deep ones, like he tried to claw at something. Soil, most likely." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Trying to escape, perhaps," Graves nodded. "Or trying to bury something." That night, as the village of Larkspur Hollow settled into uneasy sleep, Miss Marple sat by the dying fire, her thoughts running like silent threads. A boot out of place, gloves not returned properly, a watering indented, a girl too quiet, too pale, a man in a coat who walked with a limp, and now a blunt weapon and scratches in the soil dotted. Was beginning to form a pattern, not yet clear, but visible, faintly, like footsteps beneath the garden. Chapter 4, the rustle in the hedgerow. On the third day after the discovery of Mr. Edward Hargreaves' body beneath the ivy-covered garden path, Stony Gates remained draped in a thick fog of unease. The air was unusually still, as though the very village itself held its breath. Even the birds seemed quieter, their songs interrupted by the distant, muffled toll of a solitary bell from St. Mildred's Church. Word had spread swiftly, not with hysteria, but with the precise efficiency only an English village could master. In the parlor of Fern Cottage, Miss Marple sat, knitting needles in her lap and spectacles balanced delicately upon her nose. The fire crackled softly, its glow casting amber flickers across her serene expression. On a small table beside her lay a folded copy of the Stony Gates Gazette, its front page boasting in bold type, "Death in the Garden Police Inquiries. Continue." Miss Marple, however, had already read the article twice, and not because she found it particularly informative. No, it was the omissions that interested her. The newspaper had, rather uncharacteristically, failed to mention several key details: the exact positioning of the body, the curious scuff marks near the stone bench, and the fact that Mr. Hargreaves had reportedly changed his will only a week prior to his death. She had gathered these bits from a conversation she'd overheard at the greengrocer's that morning, a conversation between Mrs. Lumley and the butcher's sister, who claimed her husband had heard it from the constable himself. More importantly, the paper had entirely neglected to mention the rustle in the HEDGEROW. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward in her chair, the fire reflecting in her eyes. That sound had been mentioned only once, and quite innocuously, by young Alice Cartwright when she'd called upon Miss Marple the previous afternoon to deliver a tin of scones. "Such a lovely garden you've got, Miss Marple," Alice had said, peering through the lace curtain. "But I always feel a bit shivery around hedgerows, you know. Mum says I've an overactive imagination. but I'm sure I heard something rustling in Mr. Hargreaves' hedge that night. Just before they found him, gave me the fright of my life." Miss Marple had nodded kindly, as if indulging a child's fantasy. But her mind had not dismissed it so easily. That was the sort of detail people overlooked, or dismissed entirely. But not Miss Marple. By mid-morning, she had set out for a walk, her polished black shoes crunching softly on the gravel path that ran alongside Hargreaves Manor. A neat row of yew hedges lined the eastern edge, dense and overgrown in places. She paused at a gap where a gardener's gate opened to a narrow passage, mostly used by staff. A low cough made her turn. It was Sergeant Phipps, a tall, stoop-shouldered man with sandy hair and a courteous manner. He removed his cap upon seeing her. "Miss Marple," he greeted, with the faintest smile. "Out for your constitutional?" She returned the smile. "It does the mind good to walk, Sergeant, especially when the air's so crisp." He hesitated, then added, "We're still collecting statements. The coroner confirmed blunt force trauma, but we've no weapon yet. Possibly something like a marble ornament or a gardener's tool." Miss Marple interjected mildly. He blinked. "Possibly. Though it would have to be something heavy enough to leave that indentation." She nodded thoughtfully. "Curious thing. Murder in a garden. You know, I once heard of a case in Shropshire where a man was bludgeoned with the head of a sundial. Quite picturesque, but awfully messy." Phipps gave a weak chuckle, uncertain whether to laugh or not. "Tell me," she continued, as if merely gossiping, "was Mr. Hargreaves found with anything in his hands?" Phipps shook his head. "No, nothing of note. Empty pockets, too." "Why, do you ask?" "Oh, no reason," she said airily. "It's just that I've often found people who know they are in danger tend to clutch at something, a weapon, or a note, or even a personal item. But if he didn't..." She let the implication hang in the air. The sergeant, slightly unnerved, cleared his throat and tipped his hat. "I'd best be getting back to the constable. Good day, Miss Marple." As he strode off, Miss Marple turned again to the HEDEROW. She took a few steps closer, inspecting its base. There, partially hidden beneath some frostbitten leaves, was a scuff mark, not deep, but distinct. A man's shoe, perhaps. Or a hurried footstep. She also noticed a torn scrap of fabric caught on a twig, cream-colored linen, frayed slightly. At the edge, frowning delicately, Miss Marple took a handkerchief from her sleeve and plucked it free. It smelled faintly of lavender soap. That afternoon, Stonygates was alight with talk. At the village tea shop, chatter buzzed like bees in a hive. "Well, I never trusted that man," said Mrs. Beckwith, dabbing at her mouth with a napkin. "Always strutting about like he owned the place." "He did own the place," muttered Mr. Dawes, the postmaster. "And what about that nephew of his, Charles? I saw him arguing with Mr. Hargreaves just last Tuesday. Got quite red in the face, he did." "You're always seeing arguments," sniffed Miss Palmer from behind the counter. "You said the vicar was arguing with the milkman last week, and..." It turned out they were talking about cheese rations. From a quiet corner booth, Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. She had always believed there was more truth in village gossip than in official records, so long as one knew how to filter the exaggerations from the kernels of fact. Charles Hargreaves, the deceased's only blood relative and known to be in a difficult financial situation, was certainly an obvious suspect. But Miss Marple was not fond of obvious suspects. She remembered seeing Charles walk into the rectory garden the morning after the murder, head bowed, hands stuffed deep into his coat pockets. He hadn't noticed her sitting behind the lilac bush. She had been watching robins, or at least appearing to, but his expression had been deeply troubled. Not guilty, troubled. There was a difference. No. Miss Marple's suspicions leaned elsewhere. That evening, back at Fern Cottage, she sat by the hearth once again, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. Beside her on the table now lay the scrap of linen she'd found. Next to it, a small calling card bearing the name Dr. Lionel Carruthers. the new physician in the village, barely 2 months into his practice. He was young, well-mannered, and by all accounts competent. But Miss Marple had noticed a certain evasiveness when he'd spoken of his whereabouts the night of the murder. Something vague about attending a patient near the border of Monksfield, some 6 miles away. Yet no one else in the village had mentioned being ill that night. And then there was the matter of the lavender soap. The very scent that had wafted from his freshly laundered handkerchiefs at the church fete last month. She picked up the scrap and held it closer to the firelight. The weave was delicate, but not expensive, practical, monogram-free. Not the kind of cloth a man like Edward Hargreaves would wear. She glanced out the window, where the garden lay cloaked in mist and shadow. Somewhere in the village, someone had made a grave miscalculation. And if Miss Marple had her way, and she usually did, it would not be long before they were found out. Chapter 5, Tea and Shadows at Sycamore. Rise the following morning dawned unseasonably cool for late summer, the wind brushing the ivy-covered cottages with a hushed insistence, as though the village itself were whispering secrets. In the little parlor at Sycamore Rise, Miss Marple's needle threaded in and out of a patch of hemstitch as she listened to the faint tap of rain against the windows. She was not thinking of her embroidery. The village, it seemed, had reached a fever pitch of polite speculation. The news that Mr. Archibald Hargreaves had been found dead in the Rose Arbor, likely murdered, had stirred up the kind of hushed hysteria that St. Mead rarely experienced. While the police methodically carried out their investigations, it was the drawing rooms, grocers, and hairdressers where the real detective work unfolded, or so the villagers fancied. Miss Marple had received 2 visitors by mid-morning. First, the vicar's wife, whose deeply furrowed brow betrayed a hunger for scandal. Then young Miss Emily Watterly, who seemed half terrified and half thrilled at being in proximity to such a scandalous affair. Both left with no more than a cup of weak tea and a sense of having shared news with one who curiously never seemed surprised, but it was the visit scheduled for 3:30 that held greater significance. Mrs. Agatha Green, whose garden backed directly onto the late Mr. Hargreaves's, had telephoned earlier in the day and suggested they share tea. A chat among ladies, she had said. Just something to settle the nerves. Miss Marple had, naturally, accepted. At precisely the appointed time, she arrived at Heatherview, a prim little house with lavender borders and tightly trimmed box hedges. The parlor was dim and close, its lace curtains drawn, its air scented faintly of lemon polish and dried roses. Agatha Green poured the tea in steady, practiced movements, her hands only trembling when she reached for the milk jug. Of course, I knew something would happen, she said quietly, settling into the armchair opposite Miss Marple. Ever since Archibald came back. Oh? Miss Marple's tone was mild. You had some premonition, perhaps? Not as such. Mrs. Green adjusted her collar, then leaned forward slightly. But he wasn't well liked, you know. Always flitting in and out, never staying long enough to be trusted. And that woman. Miss Marple blinked politely. Which woman? The French one. Claudette. I forget her name. She arrived last week, you know. Claimed to be his cousin, or some such nonsense. They were arguing in the garden 3 nights ago. I could hear them plain as day. Miss Marple sipped her tea. And what were they arguing about? Money, I believe. She was speaking in that fast, breathless French way of hers. But I did catch one word clearly: inheritance. I remember it because she said it in English, very deliberate-like. Miss Marple made a soft, thoughtful hum. That is most interesting. Agatha leaned closer. Of course, I told the constable, but I dare say they won't follow it up. Young Inspector Green seemed more interested in asking me whether I'd heard footsteps after midnight, as if anyone could tell such a thing with the wind blowing like. It was, but did you? Mrs. Green paused, fingers curling tighter around her teacup. I did hear something. I thought it was a fox at first. Or a cat, maybe. But then, just as I went to shut the bedroom window, I saw a shadow. Someone standing by the arbor, not moving. Just watching. Could you tell who it was? She shook her head. Too dark, but tall. Definitely taller than Archibald. Miss Marple remained very still, her eyes fixed not on Mrs. Green, but on the teacup resting in her own lap. And how long did the figure remain there? Oh, not long. Vanished the moment I turned on the lamp. Almost as if they'd been waiting to see if anyone would notice. They spoke no more of it. Mrs. Green had begun to tremble slightly again, and Miss Marple gently turned the conversation to her begonias. Later that evening, after supper, Miss Marple took her usual turn about the village lane. The wind had dropped, leaving the hedgerows quiet, but for the occasional rustle of a small creature in the underbrush. As she walked, she passed the newly cordoned-off gate leading to Hargreaves's garden and paused. The roses there, now untouched for 2 days, had begun to droop, heavy with moisture and neglect. The arbor stood like a sentinel in mourning. Something about the garden, its symmetry, its rigid formality, seemed at odds with the chaotic circumstances of death. She remembered Agatha's words, just watching. A figure standing motionless in the shadows was not an uncommon sight in mystery novels, Miss Marple reflected. But real life had its own patterns. One did not stand still in a darkened garden without purpose, without calculation. She glanced. Up at the Hargreaves house. A light was burning on the upper floor. The silhouette of Claudette, that was indeed her name, Miss Marple had confirmed, could be seen pacing slowly, occasionally pausing to look out the window. Not mourning, precisely. Contemplating. Miss Marple continued her walk. The next morning brought fresh drama. At the post office, where Miss Hartley was known to withhold letters until sufficiently appraised of a visitor's opinions, a new twist to the tale emerged. It was Mrs. Emmett, who always wore shoes 2 sizes too tight, and whose husband had once been fined for keeping hens on the cricket pitch, who offered it. Well, she whispered behind a folded copy of the Daily Sketch, you'll never guess what the grocer's boy found. A glove, a man's glove, right in the lane behind the vicarage hedge. Muddy and torn, and blood on the lining. There were audible gasps. Even Miss Hartley leaned forward. And he gave it to the police? Asked Miss Marple mildly. Oh yes. They took it straight to Inspector Green. That's the second strange item found this week, muttered the spinster Miss Watterly, who was rarely trusted with details. First the broken locket, now a glove. Miss Marple's blue eyes sharpened slightly. What locket? Didn't you hear? Found at the edge of the arbor path, bent out of shape. No photo inside, though. Miss Marple nodded slowly, a small smile twitching at her lips. Ah, then it appears Mr. Hargreaves may have been carrying more than secrets in his pockets. Later that day, a soft knock came at Sycamore Rise. Miss Marple opened it to find young Inspector Green on the stoop. Hat in hand. Miss Marple, he said with slightly embarrassed politeness. Might I have a word? Of course, Inspector. Do come in. He stepped into the parlor, adjusting his coat. I must say, the village is in quite a state. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. People do dislike uncertainty. He gave a strained smile. Quite. Listen, I wanted your opinion. Off the record, naturally. Miss Marple gestured for him to sit. Have you met Miss Claudette yet? I have observed her, yes. What do you make of her? Miss Marple looked over her spectacles. I think she is a woman accustomed to evasion, but also a woman who might be more frightened than guilty. Green raised an eyebrow. Interesting. She is watching the village, Miss Marple said softly. But I believe someone else is watching her. Chapter 6. Threads from the past. The village of Broadhollow had entered a peculiar state of hush. It wasn't silence in the ordinary sense. Children still played under the hedgerows. Bicycles still rattled along the gravel lanes. But there was a tautness in the air, a delicate suspense strung tight across the green. People spoke in clipped tones over greengrocer counters and hushed their voices when certain names came up. The presence of death, particularly sudden death, had a way of unsettling even the most bucolic communities, and in Broad Hollow, it sent ripples through the seams of civility. Miss Marple, however, remained unshaken. She had lived long enough to know that death, while often shocking, was never as senseless as it appeared. The key, as always, lay in the details and in the way people responded to them. This particular morning, Miss Marple had accepted an invitation to tea at the vicarage. Though ostensibly a social call, it was not lost on the perceptive vicar that Miss Marple was always at her most astute when offered a pot of Darjeeling and a well-buttered scone. "I can't quite shake the feeling," Reverend Stilton said, pouring with a mild tremor in his hand, "that this whole business is somehow wrong. Not just tragic, but off." Miss Marple smiled gently. "It usually is when something has been made to appear natural, that is, in fact, not. We are not very good at accepting the truth of sudden things, you know." The vicar nodded solemnly. "But this young woman, Miss Greta, do you believe she was in trouble, so to speak?" Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly, thoughtfully. "It depends what kind of trouble you mean, Reverend. The world offers a great variety: romantic, financial, professional, and moral. But she was new here, barely acquainted with anyone beyond Lady Redfern's garden gate." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but do remember, Vicar, that it is not how long one has known a place that matters. It is how quickly one makes an impression. And Greta did make one." She paused, watching a speck of cream float to the surface of her cup. "Did you notice," she added quietly, "how uneasy Lady Redfern was at the funeral? Her composure was of the brittle sort, not the stoic kind." Reverend Stilton looked surprised. "Grief affects us all differently, Jane. She was quite shaken." "Indeed, though I dare say her distress seemed tinged with something else." The vicar offered no reply, but his troubled expression lingered. That same afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the Redfern estate, not through the front drive, but by the garden path leading past the rose arbor and the low stone wall. Lady Redfern had extended an invitation, perhaps out of guilt or courtesy, or possibly both, and Miss Marple had graciously accepted. The gardens, for all their color, now seemed subdued. Aster and delphinium swayed under a veiled sun, and the soil beneath the box hedge still bore a faint mark from where Greta had collapsed. Lady Redfern greeted her with customary poise, though her eyes betrayed fatigue. She offered tea under the pergola, and for a while they spoke of weather, roses, and the perpetual lateness of the village post. "I do hope," Lady Redfern said at length, pouring with the precision of someone desperate to control something, "that the village isn't buzzing with too much speculation." "Villages always speculate," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "But the truth has a way of enduring, no matter how many stories people layer over it." Lady Redfern studied her guest's face for a moment, as if unsure whether that was meant as comfort or warning. "I hardly knew Greta," she said finally. "She was efficient, pleasant, quiet. It's a dreadful thing what happened. And she seemed content here." "I thought so. Why?" Miss Marple looked down at her saucer, then up again. "Because I had the impression she was afraid of something or someone." Lady Redfern's expression did not change immediately, but her hand paused over the sugar bowl. "Nonsense," she said after a beat. "She never gave any indication." "No direct indication," Miss Marple agreed. "But one sees such things, in the way a girl glances over her shoulder, or clutches a letter too tightly." Now Lady Redfern's mask cracked just slightly. "I don't recall any such behavior." Miss Marple smiled faintly, then sipped her tea. Elsewhere in the village, Constable Rowntree was doing what he did best, listening to gossip while pretending to be disinterested. At the bakery, the two Miss Cornets were already engaged in spirited discussion. "I told you," said Beatrice Cornet, the elder sister. "She had been crying that morning." I saw her come out of the post office looking as if she'd been weeping. Or just cold, muttered her sister. No, her eyes were red. Ask anyone. Constable Rowntree, who was standing just behind them in line, cleared his throat politely. Ladies. Oh, Mr. Rowntree, Beatrice chirped. Isn't it awful what happened to poor Greta? We were just saying how odd she looked that day, weren't we, Edith? Edith rolled her eyes. You were saying it. I was saying she might have just had a bad cold. Did she post a letter that morning? The constable asked, casually enough. Why, yes, said Beatrice. A small envelope, pale pink, I think. She was holding it with such care, Edith added grudgingly. Like it mattered a great deal. And who collected the post that day, Mr. Cray? He mentioned it to us. Said it was addressed to somewhere in London. Constable Rowntree filed this away. That evening, as the village bell rang its gentle peal, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to young Elsie White, the housemaid employed at the Redfern estate. She found her in the modest back kitchen, peeling potatoes. With a distracted air, Miss Marple, Elsie exclaimed, standing at once. I didn't expect. Sit, dear, Miss Marple said kindly. Just a brief chat. Elsie obeyed, wiping her hands on her apron. You were fond of Miss Greta, weren't you? Elsie's eyes welled up immediately. She was. Kind to me, treated me like I mattered. Did she ever confide in you? The girl hesitated. Not exactly, but she seemed worried. A letter came about a week before she died. After that, she wasn't the same. What sort of letter? I never saw the writing, but she held it close, and later I saw her burning it in the scullery stove. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. She said she had to make a decision. I asked what she meant, but she just smiled, sad-like. That night, as moonlight spread across the hedgerows and the church spire cast a pale silhouette over the village, Miss Marple sat by her window in quiet reflection. A letter burned. A girl frightened, a mistress unnerved, and a village full of murmurings. Thought it was not yet a full picture, but she was beginning to see the outline faintly, like ink seeping through paper dot, and somewhere in the middle of it all, she knew, Leia. Motive not yet spoken aloud. Not everyone who smiled at the garden party had done so innocently. Someone had something to hide, and it had begun, perhaps, long before Greta ever arrived in Broad Hollow. Chapter 7. The letter with no address. The morning after the inquest dawned with a brooding stillness. Clouds sat low over St. Ethelrita's rooftops, smothering the light and lending the village a hush that even the sparrows seemed to respect. The curtains of Ivy Cottage remained drawn for longer than usual, but Miss Marple was already up, her breakfast of kippers and tea untouched as she stared thoughtfully at the edge of the table, her fingers gently rotating her spectacles. Though the verdict of accidental death had been delivered, the village was far from satisfied. If anything, it had only heightened the speculation. A soft knock came at the door. Come in. Cherry, Miss Marple called gently. Cherry Baker entered with a flushed face and a half curtsy, holding a small folded note. This just came through. The post slot, ma'am. No name on it, and no return address either. Miss Marple accepted the note with delicate fingers, her eyes narrowing. It was plain cream stationery, folded twice, with no envelope. The handwriting inside was neat but hurried. You are right not to believe it was an accident. Meet me behind the chapel tonight at 10. Come alone. Miss Marple read it twice before looking up at Cherry, whose eyebrows were raised and nervous. Curiosity. Well now, Miss Marple said mildly. Isn't that rather theatrical? Cherry opened her mouth to ask, but Miss Marple tucked the note beneath her saucer. Cherry, would you be kind enough to go down to Mr. Simpkins and fetch me some more of that Darjeeling I like? And perhaps some of those seed cakes as well. I may be having company later, Cherry frowned. Yes, Miss Marple, but this letter shouldn't you tell someone? Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. You've known me long enough, dear. to know that I always tell someone eventually. That afternoon brought little relief from the gloom, and much of the village seemed subdued. Reverend Chichester could be seen trimming the vicarage hedges himself, an unusual activity, while Mrs. Willow from the bakery lingered longer than necessary outside the butcher's shop, engaging Mrs. Pilling in hushed speculation. It was the kind of day that made everyone feel that they were being watched, even if they were not. Miss Marple, in contrast, remained largely indoors, organizing her gardening notes, watering her African violets, and studying her copy of the Times. She had no intention of arriving unprepared. By the time evening fell, Ivy Cottage was dark, save for the soft glow of a candle in the parlor. At exactly 10:15, Miss Marple, bundled in her navy blue shawl and sturdy boots, stepped out into the night. The chapel, nestled beside the old yew trees, was bathed in moonlight. Its gravestones leaned like whispering figures, and the smell of moss and cold earth hung in the air. Miss Marple approached the rear path, moving slowly but purposefully. A chill ran down her spine, not from fear, but from a quiet anticipation. "Miss Marple?" The voice came from the shadows, female, familiar, and tight with anxiety. A figure stepped forward, Angela Dawlish, her green coat buttoned to the throat, her blonde curls frizzed from the damp. "I'm so sorry to send that note," she whispered. "But I couldn't speak in front of the others. They don't understand. They're too quick to believe what they're told." Miss Marple tilted her head kindly. "You're quite right to be cautious, my dear. And I appreciate your bravery. But what is it that you couldn't say at the inquest?" Angela hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. "It's about Oliver, my brother. He told me something the day before Mr. Rutherford died." Miss Marple waited in silence, watching her. "He said Mr. Rutherford had found something. Something in the garden." "In the garden?" Angela nodded. "Yes. He didn't say what exactly. Only that it was buried. He was unusually upset, said Rutherford wasn't going to keep quiet about it. I thought he was being dramatic, but that night Oliver came home late, and he was pale. He kept asking if anyone had been by, if anyone had come looking. And the next day, Mr. Rutherford was found dead," Miss Marple said softly. Angela bit her lip. "And Oliver has barely left the house since." Miss Marple's brow creased in gentle thought. "Did he mention who might have buried this something? Or where in the garden it might be?" "No," Angela whispered. "But I know he was in the garden late several nights last week. He's been strange lately. Paranoid." Miss Marple placed a hand on Angela's arm. "You did well to come. Thank you, my dear." A hoot sounded in the distance, an owl, not a person. Still, Angela tensed. "I should go. I don't want him to know I spoke to you." Miss Marple nodded. "Of course." And Angela, do be cautious. Secrets, when held too long, can sour even the gentlest hearts. The following morning, Miss Marple took an early walk through the village. Her steps, seemingly idle, led her to the grange. Oliver Dawlish was in the front garden, pruning a hawthorn hedge with unnecessary aggression. His face was drawn, his jaw clenched. "Good morning, Mr. Dawlish," Miss Marple called cheerfully. He glanced up, clearly startled. "Oh, Miss Marple, didn't see you." She smiled, feigning mild amusement. "Gardening is such good exercise for the nerves, don't you think?" he grunted. "I suppose." Miss Marple looked thoughtfully over the hedge. "I've always admired the layout here. So much space. I imagine one could hide almost anything. In a garden like this." He stiffened. "Oh, not that I mean you would, of course," she continued. "But I remember my nephew's wife losing a sapphire earring once. Fell into a flower bed. Took us a week to find it." Oliver gave a tight smile. "Things do tend to get buried, don't they?" "Indeed," Miss Marple tilted her head. "And some things want to stay buried." There was a long pause before Oliver said quietly, "Well, I should get on. So much trimming to do before the frost." She left him then, slowly retreating toward the lane. Her eyes, however, noted the faint scrape marks by the edge of the hedge, sign that something had recently been dug up or buried anew. A small patch of turned earth looked fresher than the rest. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had visitors. Colonel and Mrs. Melrose arrived bearing apple tart and a heavy cloud of concern. "It's the gossip, Jane," Mrs. Melrose said with a sigh. "It's getting worse. Someone spread a rumor that Rutherford was blackmailing people in the village." Colonel Melrose's mustache twitched. "Nonsense, of course. But it's getting people riled up. Even mentioned me at the post office, can you imagine?" Miss Marple accepted a slice of tart with a nod. Sometimes gossip is a symptom, not a cause. Like a fever in a child, it points to something deeper. "You think someone's hiding something?" Mrs. Melrose asked, eyes wide. Miss Marple sipped her tea. "I think someone was hiding something. And I rather think Mr. Rutherford discovered it." "But who would go so far as to silence him?" asked the Colonel. "The man was annoying, yes, but hardly a threat." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window. "You'd be surprised what lengths people will go to when cornered by their own past." That evening, as the village settled into its uneasy slumber, Miss Marple sat by the fire, knitting in silence. The flames crackled gently, and the only sound was the rhythmic click of her needles. The pieces were beginning to take shape, not yet a full picture, but a pattern emerging. A buried item, a man threatened, a brother behaving erratically, and now rumors of blackmail. There were still too many questions, but Miss Marple knew well that truth was never found in sudden revelations. It emerged, bit by bit, like petals, opening on a tightly wound rose. And tomorrow, she intended to do a little digging of her own. Chapter 8. A trail of tea leaves and tension. The morning sun filtered dimly through the cloud cover, casting a flat gray light over the village of Elmswood, as though nature itself sensed the tension thickening among its quiet hedgerows and ivy-clad walls. The scent of yesterday's rain lingered in the hedges, mingling with the faint sweetness of flowering honeysuckle. It was a deceptive calm. Behind closed doors, the village was abuzz with private speculation and tightly whispered conversations. At Hillside Cottage, Miss Marple sat in the modest parlor, quietly stitching the hem of a linen pillowcase. She worked slowly, deliberately, her eyes moving not just across the thread, but toward the open window, where she could just make out the soft scrape of a rake across gravel. It was Mr. Edgecombe, the retired solicitor, tending his garden with more than usual vigor. His recent interview with Inspector Crail had clearly unnerved him. The papers had said little more about the late Mr. Lyle's cause of death, but Miss Marple had gleaned something from young Constable Witherby's expression when she'd run into him outside the greengrocer's. His jaw was set, and his fingers twitched at his cap. "Not accidental, then," she had murmured to herself. As expected, there was a knock at the door. She rose, composed as ever, and opened it to find Reverend Channing standing there, his cassock slightly askew and his expression flushed. "Miss Marple," he said with a strained smile, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Reverend. Do come in. Would you like a cup of tea?" He hesitated. "I won't impose. I only wished to ask, have you spoken to Mrs. Peneligon since the discovery of the body?" Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled, though her face remained grave. "Briefly. I offered her some jam I'd put up last summer. Raspberry. She didn't seem particularly keen to accept it, poor dear. Quite beside herself, I think." Channing looked relieved. "Yes, well, I only asked because—" He stopped himself, his fingers fussing with the hem of his sleeve. "There have been suggestions." "Oh?" She prompted gently. He colored. "I'm afraid it's impossible to keep anything quiet in this village. Some say that Mr. Lyle had been spending time with her late at night, and others say she was seen weeping after the parish fete. Indeed. Well, we all have our crosses to bear, Reverend." especially in matters of the heart. And gossip, of course, is rarely a trustworthy compass. His mouth opened, then shut again. He looked both grateful and chastened. Quite right, forgive me. I merely wish to prepare myself in case any further awkwardness arises. The bishop is attending the harvest compline next week. After he had gone, Miss Marple turned to the window again. A new ripple had formed in the surface of this pond. If what Reverend Channing suggested was true, or if the village believed it to be true, then Mrs. Peneligan's position as the grieving housekeeper was more precarious than it appeared. Across the green, Mrs. Banbury of Honeysuckle View had other ideas. I tell you he was pushed, she declared to Mr. Barnes, the butcher, as he wrapped up her half-pound of back bacon. People don't just fall into compost heaps and die. Not unless someone helped them. And I've never. Like that young lodger of Mrs. Tranter's, too quiet by half. Mr. Barnes, whose business benefited from silence, nodded noncommittally. Others had their suspicions elsewhere. Old Mrs. Hargreaves was convinced it was the gardener, Mr. Wills, who had a falling out with Lyle over the matter of that ornamental pond. She recalled hearing Lyle raise his voice the week before and saw Wills stalking out of the garden looking red-faced and dangerous. By contrast, at the vicarage, Mrs. Channing was anxiously sipping her tea while watching the steam curl from the spout. I can't abide how everyone is turning this into theater, she told her husband. It's not a story, Clement. It's a tragedy. That poor man ... and poor Miss Pringle, for that matter. She's been most affected. Miss Pringle? The Reverend asked, surprised. Yes, she fainted at the post office this morning, right in front of the stamps. Jessie, the postmistress, said she was murmuring something about an appointment that never happened and kept clutching a letter. This morsel fluttered its way back to Miss Marple, courtesy of the grocer's niece, who relayed it during her afternoon delivery of preserves. How curious, Miss Marple murmured as she placed a jar of damson plum on the shelf. Miss Pringle hasn't been herself since the summer dance. One wonders if the appointment was meant to be with Mr. Lyle. The evening fell more quickly than usual, clouds building over the hills, heavy with promise. Rain was due again, and it cast a gloom across the quiet hedgerows. But in the garden of Thimblewit Cottage, where the murder had occurred, a very different kind of storm was brewing. Miss Marple took it upon herself to visit the scene, on the pretext of offering Mrs. Tranter some lavender to calm her nerves. The widow accepted it gratefully, but could not bring herself to discuss the night in question. Did you notice anything unusual the evening before? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Tranter hesitated. Only that Mr. Lyle seemed distracted. Fidgety. He asked if I'd mind him working late in the potting shed. Said he had something delicate to transplant and needed the solitude. Solitude, Miss Marple echoed. Yes. And then, around 10, I thought I heard him arguing with someone. But when I stepped outside, there was no one there. Just the wind. Miss Marple asked no more, but her thoughts were whirring. The argument, the letter, Miss Pringle's faint. The signs were small, easily overlooked, but each one brushed against the edges of something more tangled than mere village scandal. That evening, as the first patter of rain returned, Miss Marple sat down to write a note, not to the police, not to the vicar, but to an old friend of hers who worked at a legal office in Basingstoke. Chapter 9. Whispers and wallflowers. The dusk had arrived gently over Stonygates, draping the village in a soft lavender haze that cloaked rooftops and quiet lanes. The hedgerows rustled faintly with a warm breeze, and a slow, heavy silence hung over Little Ambrose like an unfinished sentence. At the vicarage, the lace curtains had been drawn, and inside, the mood was markedly subdued. Miss Marple sat with Reverend Chiswell and his wife, sipping the weakest tea she'd ever tasted, in a cracked porcelain cup. Neither of them had spoken much since she arrived, and the vicar's gaze was fixed on the flickering fire, as though he hoped the flames might offer him answers he could not glean from scripture, It's not just the murder, Mrs. Chiswell said at last, her hands worrying the hem of her apron. It's the idea of it happening here, in our village. It unmoors everything. The Reverend nodded gravely. It's not just sin, Miss Marple. It's intention. Someone planned this, carried it out. And that kind of darkness doesn't simply come and go. Miss Marple smiled gently, but did not respond immediately. Instead, she glanced over at the mantel clock, whose pendulum swung back and forth like the passage of judgment itself. Sin, she murmured at last, is often rather mundane when examined closely. Pettiness, jealousy, vanity, and secrets. So very many secrets, the Reverend blinked. You believe this to be a crime rooted in, what, personal grievance? I believe, Miss Marple said gently, that the truth is always tied to something very human and terribly ordinary. Outside the vicarage, little Ambrose was already swirling with fresh currents of gossip. At Rosebriar Cottage, Miss Letitia Crowthorne had invited her dear friend Mrs. Devereux for a late evening drink, sherry served in antique crystal, ostensibly to discuss the flower rota for the altar, but really to trade news. The conversation, as always, grew dense and circuitous. I still think it's something to do with that Mr. Hargreaves, Letitia whispered, leaning closer as though the garden ivy might be listening. All that time abroad. No proper record. And have you seen his hands? Far too clean for a gardener. Mrs. Devereux's eyes widened. You don't say. And I heard from Maisie at the post office that he receives a letter every fortnight, foreign stamps. Something Cyril said once. He speaks German, apparently. Exactly, Letitia said triumphantly. Foreigners always mean trouble. They both paused for a reverent sip of sherry. But, Mrs. Devereux added with a sniff, what of Lydia? Hartfield? Always going on long walks no one sees. And she was fond of poor Timothy, wasn't she? One never forgets a girl's tone when she says a name. Or the look in her eye, Letitia agreed. Unmarried, nearing 40. Bitterness sets in. Back on the high street, at the Red Stag, the pub was uncommonly full for a Wednesday. Pint glasses clinked with an undercurrent of nerves. Not merriment. Mr. Cecil Broom, whose role as the self-proclaimed village historian often veered into pure fabrication, was gesturing dramatically. All I'm saying, he intoned, is that this has happened before. Oh yes, you ask anyone old enough. Back in 1896, there was that mess at Marnham Woods. Man killed with a spade. Never solved. Some said it was the local magistrate's wife, no less. Rubbish, muttered Edwin Shore, the butcher, into his beer. You'd blame Queen Victoria herself if it got you another minute of attention. I'm simply saying, Broom pressed, that little Ambrose has skeletons. We just forget them until one rattles loose. Meanwhile, Miss Marple had taken a most curious walk through the gardens of the Laurels by lantern light, accompanied by no one but her thoughts and a rather ancient torch lent by the housekeeper. It was still damp where the dew hadn't yet lifted. She knelt delicately beside the rose border where the first scuffle had supposedly occurred. Faint depressions still marked the soft earth. To the untrained eye, they were only muddled patches. But Miss Marple examined them with a quiet, unassuming diligence. Two sets of shoes. One narrow and pointed, perhaps women's. The other, men's brobes, she suspected. Larger, but oddly angled. She turned her attention to the back of the garden. A half-broken iron gate barely hanging on. Rusted hinges. Someone had oiled it recently. Too recently. There was no squeak. That suggested knowledge, familiarity, the kind of touch that would require time, patience, and a reason to sneak through unnoticed. Later that night, in the drawing room of the Laurels, an uncomfortable gathering had formed. Inspector Cray sat with his legs crossed, expression unreadable. Opposite him were Mr. and Mrs. Merriman, Lydia Hartfield, and Nigel Fellows. The air was taut as piano wire, and even the flicker of the oil lamp seemed hesitant. I'll ask it plainly, Cray said at last. Was there anyone who had an ongoing conflict with Mr. Hargreaves? The Merrimans glanced at each other. Not that I know of, said Mrs. Merriman carefully. He was quite reserved. Nigel, however, cleared his throat. He was also prideful, thought himself above his station. There were words once between him and Edward, the late gardener. About what? Cray asked sharply. I'm not certain. I just heard them arguing. Something about old loyalties and burying the past. Lydia, until now silent, finally spoke. Edward served in the war. Perhaps it was something from then. Miss Marple, seated quietly on a wing-back chair with her knitting, did not look up. But her needles paused for a beat. Back in her room later, Miss Marple took out a small notebook and made a few quiet notes. Her script was delicate, precise, the handwriting of someone who valued order. Mr. Hargreaves, secretive, well-read. Foreign letters. Former gardener rivalry, Edward, deceased. Unmarked boots, but polished. Old loyalties, gate oiled. Someone expected regular use. Lydia walks often. Always alone. Mrs. Merriman, nervous. Watches others more than she speaks. Knows more than she shares. Village gossip, loaded with half-truths. But emotional weight equals valuable. She closed the book softly, turned out her lamp, and lay back against her pillow. Outside, the wind brushed against the hedges with soft insistence. And somewhere far off, a fox cried out. The village of Little Ambrose slept uneasily that night. In bedrooms filled with heirlooms and secrets, old fears stirred beneath floral coverlets. But Miss Marple, ever composed, allowed herself a faint smile in the dark. Because while most people believed the killer had vanished into the shadows, she had begun to suspect they had never truly left the light. Chapter 10. The memory in the ivy the next morning broke with a hush over St. Millicent's, as if the village itself had paused in anticipation. Though the clouds hung low and heavy there was no rain, only the thick, soft quiet of a day too weighed down for storms, yet too unsettled for sun. The hedgerows sagged under dew. The fields were a dull green under a smudged sky, and ivy clung close to the stones of old walls. Damp with mystery. Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table with a cup of Darjeeling and a single slice of marmalade. Toast, her eyes drifting over a letter that had arrived in the early post. Her attention, however, was not on the carefully penned cursive of her niece Raymond's wife in Italy, but rather on the faint scratches on the envelope, a sign of it having been hastily handled. Curious, yes, but nothing in comparison to the tangle of thoughts she'd been turning over since her visit to the Phoenix Garden. The sound of the footstep, so distinct, so out of place, had not left her mind. And then there had been the look on young Lydia Phoenix's face as she'd glanced toward the rose trellis. Not fear, no, but a wary recognition. Miss Marple had seen that expression before, on a maid in St. Mary Mead who'd once stumbled upon a secret rendezvous and never quite knew whether to speak of it. That same tightly controlled silence, that glance with too much knowledge behind it. By mid-morning, Miss Marple made her way across the green to the vicarage. The path was a familiar one, trodden over many years with the slow grace of someone for whom observation was a lifelong habit. She passed the post office, where Mrs. Simmons pretended not to watch from behind the lace curtain, and nodded to Mr. March from the greengrocer's, who offered a cheery, "Morning, Miss Marple," without any real conviction. The vicarage sat snugly behind a hedge of yew, its gravel path well swept, and the lavender by the steps still giving off the faintest scent. Mrs. Calthorpe, the vicar's wife, welcomed her in with her usual flustered kindness. "Oh, Miss Marple, do come in. The vicar's in his study sermon notes, you know, but he'll be terribly pleased to see you. I do hope you'll have some of the lemon cake, though it's not quite right today." I added the sugar before the eggs, which simply never does. Miss Marple assured her it would be a delight, and soon found herself in the study with Reverend Calthorpe, a man of gentle manner and excellent memory, two qualities Miss Marple admired deeply. I had a question. She began after a few polite exchanges. About the garden party at the Phoenix. You remember the moment when Mrs. Lyle had that fainting spell? Indeed I do, he replied with a furrow of the brow. Quite the dramatic moment. I believe it interrupted young Tom Redford's performance on the cello, didn't it? Yes, said Miss Marple. But just before that, do you recall hearing anything unusual? A noise, perhaps? A footstep? The vicar paused, his fingers steepled before him. I'm not certain. There was a great deal of murmuring and movement in the crowd at that point. But yes, now that you mention it, I do recall someone turning their head rather sharply, as if reacting to something unexpected. Miss Elwood. I think. She was seated quite near the rose trellis, wasn't she? Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but inside, a thread pulled taut. She was. And I understand she was one of the last to speak to Mr. Jerome before he was found. Dead, the vicar hesitated. Do you believe there's more to his death than poor luck? I believe, Miss Marple said slowly, that Mr. Jerome's passing was not a matter of luck at all. Later that day, she took a walk through the churchyard, her pace unhurried. It was not the grave she sought, but the back path that ran behind the old rectory wall and opened out toward the Phoenix property. It had long been overgrown, but in recent years it had been used occasionally by children and gardeners alike. She paused near a gap in the ivy where a section of the wall had partially crumbled, and leaned in to inspect the earth below. There, a partial footprint, faint but discernible. It was not recent, certainly not from that morning, but it had pressed. Deep enough to suggest haste. She heard a soft clearing of a throat behind her. I thought you might come here, said Inspector Cray. Miss Marple straightened. It's a pleasant place for a walk. You're not the only one who thinks. So, Crail said, glancing at the wall. My men found similar marks here yesterday. And something else. He held out a small object wrapped in a handkerchief, a hair comb. Tortoiseshell, snapped at the edge. Found just under the bramble bush there, he said. Matches one from Mrs. Fenwick's dressing table. Miss Marple nodded. And yet she hasn't mentioned it missing. No, Crail said, she hasn't. They stood in silence, watching a rook wheel above the church spire. There's more to this than I first thought, Crail admitted. At first I chalked it up to the usual a bit of scandal. A man who knew too much about someone's affairs, perhaps. But now it seems like there are layers upon layers. Miss Marple turned to him, her eyes bright. You're quite right, Inspector. And you must tread gently, because you see, it isn't only scandal, it's fear. Someone is afraid the truth will crawl out from under their perfect garden. And fear makes people terribly unpredictable. That evening, as twilight smeared the sky in lilac and ash, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Lydia Fenwick. She was seated on the bench beneath the rose trellis, her sketchpad forgotten on her lap. It's strange, Lydia said softly after they'd spoken for a while. I keep thinking I heard something that afternoon. Not just a footstep, a whisper, a voice low but urgent. I couldn't make out the words. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. And have you told your mother? Lydia shook her head. She wouldn't believe me. She says I've been over-imaginative since I was a girl. Miss Marple regarded her. Sometimes, Lydia, imagination is merely the ability to notice what others refuse to see. That's a rare gift. There was a pause. I think, Lydia said quietly, that someone else was in the garden that day. Someone who wasn't meant to be. Someone who saw something, or was afraid of being seen. Miss Marple laid a hand lightly on hers. That's very helpful, my dear, and very brave. She rose to leave, her mind alive with threads weaving closer to the heart of the mystery. The broken comb, the footstep, the whisper, the hush that followed Mrs. Lyle's fainting. So many pieces, each inconclusive on its own. But together, they began to hum with a dreadful coherence. As she walked home, a single phrase echoed in her mind. Ivy remembers. And somewhere beneath, the garden, beneath the carefully swept gravel and prim flower beds, a truth waited to be unearthed.